Mitch McConnell had drawn his line, not just against an opponent, against Donald Trump himself. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. Cancel him. Finish him. And in the shadows of the Capitol, the word impeach was no longer a rumor. It was a plan. But the Senate floor isn't where the plan fell apart. It was on live TV when JD Vance stepped forward and exposed a secret Mitch McConnell had kept buried for decades. By the time McConnell realized what was happening, the damage wasn't just political, it was personal. Like and subscribe if you believe power always looks different when the lights are on. Tell us in the comments, was this loyalty or political suicide? In Washington, the most dangerous mistake is assuming the vote is in the bag. The chamber was half in shadow, half in television light. The corridors buzzed with the quiet certainty that this impeachment push was already mapped out. Names counted, statements drafted, press releases timed down to the minute. Mitch McConnell sat at the center of it, not physically, he preferred the margins in moments like these, but in control. Every nod, every sidelong glance from senior members confirmed the plan. Trump was to be sidelined. This wasn't just about policy, it was about permanence. Senators moved like actors in a play they'd rehearsed. Whispers along the benches carried no urgency, only confirmation. The votes would hold, the press would follow, and by week's end, Donald Trump would be politically caged. At least that's what everyone thought. Across the aisle, JD Vance watched it all without taking notes, without joining the huddled strategy clusters. He wasn't part of the plan, not in the way McConnell expected. What most didn't notice, and what McConnell had forgotten, was that Vance had been carrying something. Not a bill, not a speech, a piece of McConnell's past that had never seen daylight. And before the day was over, it would. It wasn't the speech that tipped them off. It was the silence before it. McConnell's whip team was relaxed. Too relaxed. They were leaning back in their seats, half listening to procedural chatter, eyes darting occasionally to the press gallery to make sure the cameras were catching the right angles. That's why the shift was so easy to miss. JD Vance had been still all morning, not distracted, not tense, just still. The kind of still that makes you wonder if someone's waiting for the exact second to move. When his name was unexpectedly called for a procedural comment, he stood slowly. No stack of papers, no binder, just a thin manila folder in his left hand. He didn't open it. "Mr. President, I rise for a point of information," he said, voice even, almost casual. McConnell barely glanced up. This wasn't unusual. Senators toss in these interruptions all the time. But the presiding officer leaned forward just slightly, sensing the tone. "I want to be sure," Vance continued, "that in the process of considering the removal of a former president, we are also consistent about the standards we apply to our own leadership." Heads turned. That wasn't the script. Not for this day. 2 rows behind McConnell, a staffer shifted uncomfortably. Another scribbled something on a legal pad and slid it to a colleague. The plan had depended on perfect choreography, and for the first time, McConnell's eyes narrowed just a fraction. The first crack in his composure. Because Vance hadn't even opened the folder yet, and already the room felt like it belonged to him. In one sentence, he stopped talking about Trump and started talking about McConnell. Vance didn't waste the chamber's attention. He took a single step forward, rested the manila folder on the desk before him, and let his hand rest lightly on top of it. "The senior senator from Kentucky," he began, and suddenly it wasn't about procedure anymore. McConnell's gaze lifted fully now, brows tight, chin angled in that subtle warning posture he'd perfected over decades. Vance continued, his tone as controlled as a closing argument. "Has spoken often about loyalty, about integrity, about the importance of putting the country before any one man. I agree with him, which is why, before we cast a vote that will shape the future of this republic, we should make sure we understand the full measure of that standard." Whispers started in the back. A camera operator zoomed in. Vance's right hand opened the folder, slowly, deliberately, revealing a few stapled pages, the kind you'd expect from an internal memo, not a public record. These are documents, uncontested, outlining financial arrangements between this body's leadership and corporate entities with direct interest in the legislation and investigations overseen during the last 2 election cycles. Now it wasn't whispers. It was the sound of every staffer in the chamber reaching for a phone. McConnell's lips barely moved, but the slight, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw was visible even from the gallery. Vance wasn't shouting. He wasn't accusing outright. He was doing something far more dangerous. Laying out a trail, and every senator in that room knew where that trail was pointing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The paper did it for him. Vance held the top page like it was nothing more than a note for the clerk. But when he began reading, the air in the chamber seemed to thin. Line item 14, disbursement records from Bluegrass Strategies, LLC, a consulting firm tied directly to the senior senator from Kentucky's re-election committee, $1.2 million from an overseas shipping conglomerate whose executives have testified before this chamber and whose regulatory exemptions were advanced within the same fiscal quarter. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. McConnell shifted slightly in his chair, the first physical acknowledgement that Vance was no longer circling. He was landing. Vance turned the page. Correspondence dated April 17, 2020. An email exchange between a senior aide to the senator and a representative of that same conglomerate discussing mutual legislative understanding ahead of an infrastructure bill markup. A murmur spread through the floor. Senators leaning toward each other, staffers quietly excusing themselves to the hallway. McConnell kept his gaze fixed forward, but the corners of his mouth tightened with each citation. Vance closed the folder halfway, looked directly across the chamber, and said, "If we are to judge one man for the standards we claim to uphold, we must be prepared to live under those same standards ourselves, or admit this has nothing to do with principle." It was the first time all day that the impeachment resolution wasn't the center of attention. Now, the question wasn't whether Trump should be canceled. It was whether McConnell could survive the fallout from what had just been put on record. He reached for the levers he'd pulled his entire career. Only this time, they weren't there. McConnell's hand moved toward his microphone. It wasn't hurried, he never hurried, but there was a new edge in the way his fingers gripped the base. "The junior senator from Ohio," McConnell began, "is free to engage in innuendo, but this chamber should not confuse political theater with the serious business before us." Vance didn't look away. "With respect, leader," he said, "these are your documents, not theater, not rumor. They're signed, dated, and verified by your own campaign filings." The chamber froze. McConnell paused, just long enough for the press gallery to catch the tension before speaking again. The senator would do well to remember that attacking one's own leadership plays directly into the hands of those who wish to see this party divided. Vance leaned slightly forward, hands resting on the desk, voice steady. "What divides us isn't speaking the truth. What divides us is pretending the truth doesn't matter when it's inconvenient." McConnell glanced to his right, searching for the familiar nods from allies. They weren't there. Several kept their eyes on their desks. He cleared his throat, but the momentum was gone. The impeachment debate was no longer his show. Vance had shifted the narrative without raising his tone, and McConnell was left holding the gavel in a room that no longer felt like it belonged to him. The vote hadn't even started, and the outside world was already reacting to something they weren't supposed to see yet. McConnell was still at the mic, trying to pull the conversation back toward Trump, toward the language of duty, history, and restoring trust. But the sound in the chamber had changed. In the back rows, staffers were staring at their phones. Two slipped out the side doors without bothering to hide it. Somewhere between Vance's first citation and McConnell's last sentence, images of those documents, clean scans, highlighted lines, had made their way to a political reporter known for moving fast. By the time the floor speeches were winding down, an alert hit every phone in the gallery. Exclusive. Internal records tie McConnell to foreign-linked corporate contributions. It wasn't a full story, just enough to confirm the leak was real, and it included one screenshot, the April 17th email Vance had read aloud. You could feel the energy shift in the chamber. Every senator with a press team knew what was coming. Every camera knew where to point. McConnell's voice grew tighter, even as he tried to keep his cadence. He knew this wasn't just a chamber problem anymore. And Vance, still standing at his desk, hands folded, didn't need to say another word. Because in Washington, once something leaks, you can't call it back. You can only watch it grow. The vote went ahead, but it wasn't the result people remembered. The clerk called the roll. One by one, senators cast their votes, some with rehearsed speeches, others with clipped one-word answers. McConnell's motion to convict Trump failed by a narrow margin. That should have been the headline. It wasn't. Outside the chamber, the press swarmed, not to ask about the trial's outcome, but to shove microphones toward McConnell. Leader, are the leaked records authentic? Did you or your campaign coordinate with that conglomerate on legislation? Should you recuse yourself from future ethics votes? McConnell's answers were short, almost inaudible over the chaos. JD Vance passed through the throng quietly, not stopping, not smirking, just leaving the building as if the day was over for him. Hours later, every network was running the same split screen. On the left, the vote tally. On the right, the highlighted email from McConnell's file. And in the chyron below, a line from Vance's speech. If we judge one man by a standard, we live under it ourselves. McConnell had walked into the chamber thinking the day was about Trump. He left knowing the standard he'd invoked had cut straight back to him. And for the first time in years, Mitch McConnell wasn't controlling the story. Like and subscribe if you think political standards should apply equally. Tell us in the comments, was Vance defending Trump or just exposing hypocrisy?